We know that cultural activity and being engaged with culture has a really high correlation to being happier, living a happier life and being more functional societies. But those are statistics that get trotted out to justify arts funding, but they're true. They're based on reality, which is that having culture in our lives makes us better people, makes us more empathetic, and having spaces to enjoy that communally amplifies that even more.
Hello, hello. Welcome back to 5 a.m. Story Talk, a place to talk about stories in all their forms, the craft that goes into them, and the role that art plays in our lives. I'm Cole Haddon, and today I'll be joined by Veronica Sullivan, director of the Melbourne Writers Festival, who's here to talk about curating literary festivals, how they've evolved, and how they might even reckon with dramatic changes taking place in media, such as Substack emerging as a home for independent journalists and authors and other refugees from traditional publishing. But first, we should probably talk about the elephant in the room, or maybe we should call it the kangaroo in the room. As you've heard me reference in earlier episodes, I live in Australia, just outside Melbourne, where I'll be attending the Melbourne Writers Festival between May 8th and 11th, by the way. You wouldn't know I'm an Aussie based on my accent, but it is true. And it's weird too, because I've been an Aussie since I was born. My mom emigrated to the US to marry my father, which is a story for another day. But that's how I wound up growing up in Detroit. The backward thing I did was return to Australia to live with my wife and kids, which the children of immigrants almost never do. So now I'm the Aussie with the American accent who is constantly mistaken for Canadian because nobody wants to directly ask if I'm American because that would be fucking awkward since talking about America these days, at least if you're outside of America, is kind of like how people talked about Germany in 1938. Anyway, the point of all of this is I'll be talking about Australia quite a bit on this podcast, despite what the accent might otherwise suggest. I'm going to have lots of Aussie guests too, including, for example, Sophie Hyde, who directed Good Luck to You, Leo Grande, Black Douglas, Archibald Prize winner and one of my favorite Aussie fine artists, and the Cairns brothers, who wrote and directed Late Night with the Devil. I have some other dream Aussies to get involved, but we'll see. Curating this podcast is a lot of work, but also kind of thrilling since I get to sit down with so many people I admire. That's my long-winded way of setting up today's guest, Veronica Sullivan. It might not seem immediately obvious why I'm talking to the director of a writers' festival taking place on what is the far side of the world for most of you. But you need to trust me on this one if you're a lover of the arts or any kind of artist at all. And if you're listening to this podcast, I'm willing to bet you're one or both of those. A, she's an Aussie, and we're going to talk about Aussie culture, in particular its literary and publishing history. But B, I think this conversation has a lot to say about how festival curation is rapidly evolving in the 21st century, why we need to run back toward difficult, challenging conversations about our culture, the value of communal art events like the Melbourne Writers Festival, and how independent publishing platforms like, say, Substack might challenge such literary festivals in the future. That last one is key because a lot of you might be considering a life as an independent author or journalist. Maybe you're eyeing Substack or similar. How might you fit into the future of literary festivals? Or rather, how will festivals have to further evolve to recognize all the wonderful writers who have abandoned traditional media and publishing? Though one might say traditional media and publishing abandoned them first. As for Veronica, in addition to being the Melbourne Writers Festival's director, she's wildly accomplished. I describe her as an important member of Australia's literati, given the fact that she has or has had her fingers in so many cultural pots here. A literary editor, program director, literary prize manager, arts and culture podcast host, essayist, book reviewer. I mean, I could go on, but you get the point. She's brilliant, and I loved talking about art with her. Before she joins me, though, I want to ask you to be sure to hit subscribe if you haven't already. That is, if you don't want to miss out on more of these conversations. If you enjoyed the episode, your likes, shares, and reviews are appreciated and hugely helpful to a new podcast like 5 a.m. Story Talk. And don't forget that every episode is followed by a bonus episode in which my guests discuss a seminal piece of art from their lives. And I loved Veronica's pick. Okay, that's enough of that. Let me introduce you to Veronica Sullivan, director of the Melbourne Writers Festival that's taking place from May 8th to 11th. So, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, Veronica. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. How are you doing today? How's your anxiety doing now, also, since you're 5 weeks out, I think, from the start of the festival?
Yeah, thanks, Cole. Thank you for having me, first of all. Very excited for our chat. And I would say anxiety levels, very manageable. It's kind of the nervous excitement rather than pounding, like thrumming anxiety. So at this point, just really excited to be putting on a festival. And it feels like a bit of a freight train that's got a bit of its own momentum. And I'm kind of ready to just push it on the tracks and let it roll on.
Well, I'm going to tackle my first question. First, apologies for how long winded this setup is going to be. I wanted to start by asking a rather big question about the role of biography in art in the 21st century. Because of the ubiquity of information on the internet, social media, and a marketing focus on artists' personal stories, it often feels to me like our emotional experience of new art is being informed by what we know about an artist, good and sometimes bad, rather than experiencing it from the same place of ignorance most people would have, say, read a new novel in 1955. So rather than get to know an artist through their work, we get to know them through the media, I mean. And so I guess what I'm asking is, how do you feel about our relationship to, or say, interest in artists' biographies in 2025? A
Mm.
big question.
Yeah, I mean, I love a big, chewy question to kick off. And this is something that I think about a lot, but I'm also mindful that I've only ever really lived in an era, or certainly as an adult, in an era where this has been the culture to some degree. So it is really interesting to think about how that's changed. But of course, we only know our own experience and relationships to art firsthand. But I suppose I feel that that impulse to understand the creator of a work is a very human one, because it is in some ways a reminder that art is a human thing. It's made, it's not, doesn't, it's not made by AI. It doesn't just spring out of a void. It is coming from real people. And so I have that impulse, I love particularly reading like the acknowledgements of a book and kind of getting a little glimpse and a voice directly from the author. But I don't necessarily consider that to be a window into the work. It's just a kind of curiosity or a desire to see the bigger picture. So I think that for me, that the artwork itself is its own thing, and I always want to let that have primacy and be its own thing. And an artwork will generally tell us more about ourselves as the readers or the watchers or the consumers than it does about the person who made it. I'm much more interested in the effect that it has on the reader than what it's doing for the writer per se. But certainly that ability to kind of get a window or understanding of biographical details of a writer or a creator, it does enrich and deepen my emotional experience without necessarily shaping it. So I guess like I think about this because I love having a bit of that information, but I also try to avoid it in some way. So I typically avoid reading really long or detailed reviews of books before I've actually read them myself if I know I want to read them. But I will often seek out profiles or like listen to interviews with the writer to kind of understand where it's come from, why they've made it. And something that's really interesting in working in the kind of book industry and having access to advanced reading copies, which often come many months before publication, and particularly for debut writers, sometimes they're not really accompanied by very much info at all. And so that can actually be an opportunity to engage with something where there's barely any information available online, or it's not someone that I've come across before. And that's a real pleasure as well. So I guess those are my personal approaches. I think in a broader sense, like the success of Elena Ferrante's books and how much people have kind of become fixated on those and really taken them up and connected with them shows that we don't need that biographical information to have a work resonate with a reader or with a viewer or whatever it might be, depending on form. But then conversely, everyone's obsessed with finding out who Ferrante is and desperately trying to get to the bottom of her identity. So that tension is present, I suppose, at every point.
Indeed. I find I've struggled in the last decade or so with how you pass by a painting. I started to realize you pass by a painting and you look at the name first. And I discovered this was a very common phenomenon where you judge the painting based on whether or not the artist is important. So instead of enjoying the painting first, you need to qualify it in some way. And there are all these wonderful examples of brilliant violinists playing in subways and not being able to make $5 in tips, but typically they're playing at the highest levels around the world.
Mm.
And it's just it's I've become fascinated with this, the tension between knowing and not knowing, and how it affects my ability to enjoy art, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
I mean, I'm the same in a gallery. It's something I have to actively push back against within myself, and probably it's partially because the written word is my preferred form. But I find myself reading the didactic about an artwork before I actually look at it and allow myself to have that initial emotional response. And it's like, I want the context, I want the biography, I want the where does this fit within a movement, and that stuff is very important and enriching to the work. But I also, where I can create those boundaries around my own reception, I really try to. And the violinist in subways thing that you just mentioned just reminded me that I saw a video last night on social media that was Jimmy Fallon and Ed Sheeran in a subway performing Pink Pony Club in disguise. And it's that, I feel like those videos always go really viral where you have a big name musician who's undercover in a public space, and it's like people are passing by, not paying them any mind. And you kind of think, oh, the joke's on the passers by, and they don't realize they're in the presence of greatness. But then you think, well, do we need to know that it's great in order to actually just enjoy the moment?
It challenges our relationship to art. I think, the degree to which art for some people, how would I describe it, that it is it's validating for the viewer, that
Mm,
I'm appreciating this important piece of art right now, rather than pausing to appreciate the
mm,
art just for itself. And it could have been created by a 19-year-old nobody in a country you've never heard of, and it can be just as powerful as the Rembrandt on the opposite wall. So I've read a lot about your accomplishments as a writer, editor, and more, but not nearly enough about who you were before you decided to get an MFA in creative writing. And so, how did your love affair with writing start?
well, I think it was kind of just always a big part of my life and a big draw. My kind of greatest hobby and interest as a child was reading. I was an only child until the age of 12. So
Mm.
now I have wonderful, much younger half siblings, but those formative childhood years, I was an only child, and I was just always very bookish and always in a corner with a book. The primary school librarian allowed me to have unlimited book borrowings, which was a very big privilege, and everyone was very jealous. So it was always a passion for me. And then I think when you're kind of moving through secondary education and starting to have the the powers that be within the school, and also just in life generally, always asking like, what are you going to do professionally? What are your career plans? It was very hard for me to see what a career would look like in books that wasn't either a journalist or an editor. Like those felt like they were the options for people who wanted to work with books. I never really saw myself as being a writer personally. Like I had that passion for the written word and deep engagement with it. And I did study creative writing ultimately, but I just knew I wanted to be around books in my professional life and personal life forever in some way. So I think the kind of teenage years, I didn't really know what that was going to look like, but it was just always there. It was just always kind of a big driving force for me, and
Mm.
remains so. And so my first job out of high school was working in a bookstore, and I worked there for about 7 years, and I worked there while I was going through uni and while I started sort of getting a bit more of a sense of the landscape, the literary community, and what the kind of broad scope of the bookish world, particularly in Melbourne, but also more broadly, looked like. And I have to say that working in a bookstore was the best thing possible, not only in terms of broadening my reading and just kind of giving me a much wider sense of all of the different types of books that were being created, but also like introducing me to the the people who worked in the bookstore and who come into the bookstore, who are the best people and the most interesting people, many of them working in literature in some way, or just, I guess, people who've made careers in writing. And that sort of started to open up this landscape to me in a very exciting way. So that was the best possible first job. I mean, I did work in an ice cream store before that, but I don't count that as a real job.
Well, so I think many of my listeners will not be as familiar with Australian fiction. You certainly are widely read beyond Australia's borders, but also within its borders. So, what makes Australian fiction, even publishing in general, unique in the world, do you think?
Mm. Oh, I love that question. Australia does have a really thriving literary culture, both in terms of the caliber and the number of writers. We also have had a very strong independent publishing scene over the past sort of 30 years or so, although that's being kind of threatened now by multinationals and takeovers, as is the case globally. But I think we've had the conditions for supportive writers in kind of a really pivotal time. So there's been, I guess, the conditions for people to pursue creative careers. And we also, I think there's that geographic remove from a lot of Western culture that we're both influenced by it, and it's very much exported to Australia and very kind of ever present. I'm talking in our media, on our screens, on our shelves. American and particularly Anglosphere culture has a very strong presence. But because we're not actually that physically close, we had to develop our own culture, I think, as a country, and particularly before information was as globalized as it is now. So it's kind of, I think that there's a bit of a sense of a chip on our shoulder of like, we've got something to prove. But I also think there's been this real benefit and privilege of kind of having a bit of time and space to build that. So for a relatively small country, we do have a very strong, I mean, small population wise, not geographically, but we do have a very strong culture and just a really remarkable array of writers. And when I look at the contemporary literary landscape in Australia, it's pretty amazing in terms of the richness, the kind of formal daringness that we see, the wide range of types of writers and stories. That's not to say it's perfect, and there's lots of things that I could pick out about that are imperfect about Australian literary culture. One that comes to mind is that particularly genre fiction, it's still like a really hard market for genre writers to be published in Australia, and often they need to go overseas to get published. But having said that, when you look at our bookshelves, bookstores, review pages, there's just this wealth of amazing writers coming through, and indeed many who've been around for decades. So yeah, I don't know that I could pinpoint it, but I just fully and wholeheartedly believe in how robust and incredible our culture is.
So I'd love to get into the Melbourne Writers Festival at this point. It takes place May 8th to 11th this year. You're its festival director. And so I suppose I'm curious, as a lover of literary festivals myself, how do you start dreaming up your lineup, your events, a theme even? It's an act of creation itself, not dissimilar from storytelling, I imagine.
Yeah, I love that you said that, Cole, because that's how I feel. I said before that I've never really considered myself or aspired to be a writer, but I find the act of curation really creatively satisfying and kind of fulfilling. So I do view it as like a creative act. Where do you begin? Well, I came into the festival about 7 months ago, and our program launched 2 weeks ago. So it was quite a short time frame as far as these things go. And I really just had to jump into it and kind of not overthink it too much, kind of be led by instinct and by gut feeling while also keeping a big picture view. So a lot of the curation of the festival is informed by what books are coming out, with international guests. It's which international authors are available and interested in coming to Australia at the time of the festival. And then there's also just, things that cross my radar by happenstance where I think that would make an amazing event. Let's find a way to weave it into the fabric of the festival. So it's this kind of alchemy where in any one particular event or artist case, there will be a particular set of circumstances that have led to that coming together. There are certain things that I'm interested in as a curator and probably also as an audience member. Like, got to be honest, of course, I'm following my own passions and things that I'd like to see on stage as well. And those including a really wide range of genres. So thinking about beyond literary fiction, which is definitely a mainstay of many literary festivals, Melbourne Writers Festival included. So thinking about different types and forms of storytelling as well. Podcasts, in fact, are a big passion, and we have some live podcast recordings at the festival. And also just things that are a little bit playful and give writers an opportunity to maybe try something that they haven't done before. So I suppose it's a balance of the traditional conversations that people might be used to seeing at a writers' festival, whether that's an author solo talking about their work or a panel discussion that brings people together who have shared thematic or subject matter concerns in their work, but also creating opportunities for performance and play and kind of surprising discovery. We have a series of readings at a bar. Some of those are free. Some of well, most of them are free actually, but some of them we're not even announcing who the artists are in advance, and that will just be kind of like a pop-up thing. If you happen to be in that bar on the festival Saturday, you'll see a poet reading new work and you might not even know who they are up until that point. And also commissioning new opportunities for writers to respond to festival theme or to be part of a spoken word salon. So it's a big, beautiful, messy kind of constellation. You mentioned the theme as well. So our theme this year is magical thinking. And that was something that emerged for me. I had a few different possible themes. I have just a note in my phone where I drop things in there that come to me, and most of them are terrible, as you would expect. And some of them I think, oh, maybe one day, if the circumstances are aligning, that could end up being kind of the right focus for a festival. And magical thinking just really lingered with me because it's such an interesting term that has so many meanings in different contexts. Like, it has different associations in psychological fields, in anthropology, in literature. It, a very strong kind of evocation of Joan Didion's era of magical thinking, but I think also a bit of a kind of nod towards magical realism and fantasy. And the way I've applied it and kind of interpreted it for the festival is the magic of books and stories and that kind of indefinable, intangible quality that books and reading hold for us. So I kind of had that theme bopping around, and then some of the events that I was starting to confirm had really strong links to ideas of thought and thinking. So we have philosopher AC Grayling coming to speak about cancel culture, actually, very relevant to the discussion we were having earlier about art and artists and how we consider art in light of the artist's behaviour or biographies. And so there's this philosophical kind of dimension. We also have we have a session with wonderful autistic writers speaking about how they think and write in ways that are informed by their neurodiversity. We have some really wonderful fantasy authors appearing at the festival as well, and these are people who do really create different worlds for us as readers to explore and dive into. So the theme is a really useful framing device, but it's never something that I feel like slavishly I have to adhere to, or if an amazing writer or event comes along, I would never say that doesn't fit the theme, and so it's not going to be part of the festival.
A moment ago, you referenced that you are also curating based around what you want to see. Are you allowed to say which event you're most excited about?
I don't think I have an honest answer to that because I'm so excited about everything. But there are definitely some that I've sort of had in mind maybe for a few years, and this has been an opportunity to bring it to life. So one is a translation slam, which is not a concept that I invented. It's originally a French event format where two translators come together and are each given a piece of previously untranslated text and invited to both translate it separately. And then they come together at the event and their respective translations are sort of projected side by side on the screen. And the audience get to see how kind of different their approaches to that text have been, decisions that they've made to try and convey the authentic voice of the original writer, and they kind of defend and compare their work together. And so this year, when we confirmed the wonderful Argentine novelist and short story writer Mariana Enriquez was coming to the festival, I really wanted to see if we could do a translation slam with her as the guest of honour. So Mariana has provided this work of hers that's never been published or translated before, is in Spanish, and 2 Spanish to English translators are going to translate that work. So that's kind of, yeah, one of those things that I've wanted to do for a long time. And the festival feels like a perfect context for that, because we've got this amazing writer who writes in a language other than English, and we've got an opportunity to demystify the process of translating for audiences who may not have come across it before.
I don't know why that excites me so much, but I love that that idea.
I know, and it's like, I think it appeals to people who are translators or who are in that world and think about those things a lot. But for anyone who reads works in translation, you always have that question in your mind of how different would this be if I was reading it in its original language? And it's something like, I'm monolingual. I'll never know what the other, what the original text reading experience was like. And I've also had that experience, as I'm sure you have and everyone has, that sometimes you're reading a work in translation and you're like, I'm not enjoying this. It's not hitting, but I feel like it might be the translation and that the
Mm.
original probably is amazing.
Language is so subjective. So
Yeah.
the translation, just the experiment of seeing that played out, yeah, that's really exciting. This is more of a technical question about how festivals are assembled in 2025, but we are more conscious than ever about artists' behavior outside of their work. Do you vet your guests beforehand? Is that something that has now been worked into the curation process, the festival process?
Like, the simple answer is yes, but I kind of hate the word vet because it sounds so so like administrative and so kind of, rules bound. And I suppose I think
Review,
review,
assess.
yeah, and that would always be the case for me personally, because in any curation context and in any festival or events context, I want to create a space where the writers can speak really freely on stage. And so I want to give them the opportunity to be on stage and to share their views. But I have to have some confidence that those views are going to be constructive, informed, interesting, so I suppose I think of that as always having been part of the curation process to some degree. And then, of course, there are also things where there might be someone whose writing is really interesting, but if there are perspectives or things that they might be wanting to share in a stage context that are not right for the festival, it's not a matter of me censoring them or saying, like, you can't say X, Y, Z. It's probably just a curatorial decision about maybe Melbourne Writers Festival isn't the right space for that writer to speak. And that comes back to the question that you asked at the beginning, which is the art and the artist are different things. And I think it's really important that we have that separability between them. And it's not a judgment on the quality of the work as to whether the writer is someone that I would invite to be on a stage necessarily. It might be that a little bit as well, but often it's not. And I suppose there is so many incredible writers, both in Australia and globally, and there's always way more than that I would love to include that I cannot. So it's more a matter of who are the right people to bring on stage, rather than saying you're out for XYZ reason, if that makes
No,
sense.
it does. I like the word constructive you use. I'm an angry progressive, but I still think that there is value in different perspectives from mine, and there is, I think, a perspective globally that the arts are, I mean, they tend to be a far more progressive
Mm.
space, but that there is censorship or silencing that takes place. And so I think having something constructive to add that isn't necessarily comfortable for everyone present is valuable. So I like that word. It's a good word choice.
I 100% agree with all of that. I think I'm really mindful of the power of a live event space and a live conversation and the opportunity to create a dialogue. I'm also really mindful of the limitations of a writers' festival context and of thinking through whether a potential conversation is going to have that constructive outcome or is pitting people against each other in a kind of gladiatorial, verbal combat. And I want the former. That's what I want as a curator. That's what I want as an audience member. I think that you need to have that basis of good faith and of people approaching a conversation, willing to hear one another out. If people are just coming to be didactic, that's not a good experience for anybody, really. It might be something you watch on TV, but it's not very nice in a live event space often. So I think that, yeah, the ability to have conflicting views is so important. And it is something that the arts has struggled with in Australia and globally, particularly in the past 18 months. But that doesn't mean that we give up or that we say we don't have those spaces or we don't try and create those spaces still. It just means there has to be so much care and consideration put into them. And an event that comes to mind in this year's Melbourne Writers Festival, I mentioned earlier that AC Grayling's coming to the festival. We're having a panel discussion about cancel culture and about these questions of can you separate art from artist? And I find cancel culture a really fascinating subject because it's one that people typically have very strong views about, and that those views are not necessarily neatly divided into progressives think this and conservatives think this. Like, it's a kind of people on all sides of politics have a very strong point of view, but those views can shift depending on the circumstances. I think all of us can be quite hypocritical or inconsistent in our views depending on like a particular case or individual. And I find that a really interesting and I think a really constructive conversation to have. And for that event, I feel really confident in the speakers, including Professor Grayling, a local cultural critic, Tara Kenny, and a journalist, Osman Faruqi, and it's hosted by another critic. I think they'll all have strong views on this. I don't think that they'll agree, but I think they'll be coming to that conversation ready to have it out, but from a place of we want to have the intellectual kind of debate, not tear one another down or prove one another wrong.
Another subject that I think is controversial or becoming even more so in Australia and around the globe is representation, diversity, backlash against that. But when I look at the lineup to this festival, I'm just kind of awed by the representation I see. This isn't a writers' festival I would have gone to 10 years ago, maybe not even 5 years ago. And so I'm curious if you could talk about that, but also if you feel there is more room for improvement.
Mm. I mean, I think there's always room for improvement. I think, yeah, looking at our lineup, I mean, I haven't done like a statistical breakdown yet. I will at some point for our funders, I'm sure. But I think for me, in approaching the programming, it's just more interesting to have more perspectives and people with different kind of lived experiences, but also different cultural traditions that inform their writing and inform their storytelling. Like, that makes for a richer program and for more interesting conversations than if the perspectives that were on the stages were more uniform. So I approach it from the creative lens, and something I really find counterproductive is kind of approaching things in a box ticking way, or, you know, it veers into tokenism, I think, very quickly. And I should say also that in many respects, it is a response to what people are reading, to what's being published. Like, I think that the Australian publishing industry and globally is doing very well comparatively to, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, in terms of having a lot more diverse books and writers that are being heard and being published. So it's a very symbiotic relationship. And my experience is also that audiences love that. And I want the festival to be an event that, I want the festival as a whole to be something that every individual in Melbourne will be able to find an event that speaks to them. And that means having the most diverse program possible. I don't think that every event is going to appeal to everybody. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who would look at the program and they might see 2 or 3 or 10 things that really appeal to them, but they might see a few others that are like, that is so not for me. And I think that's good. Like, that's healthy.
It is good, and I really appreciate that distinction that you draw there. You're not supposed to go to a literary festival and attend every single event. You're not the center of the universe, but there will be events for you.
That's impossible. I think Flash.
So publishing and the distribution of art in general is changing with technology, and also I think an increasing disconnect between the interests of artists and the interests of major corporations. I'm thinking of something like Substack here, where this podcast will be hosted. What do you make of the future of, say, publishing when an author's reach, the ability to connect with readers might be dramatically improved, self-publishing there than in literary journals you've worked on or I've read for most of my life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the ways that we distribute and consume culture are always evolving, and generally it's for the good. Like if people need something and it doesn't exist, there will be some kind of individual or collective mass or movement to make it. I think Substack is so interesting because it has just gone absolutely gangbusters in the past few years, and it's enabling writers to kind of take a bit more control over their ideas and over the revenue that those ideas generate. I love the publishing industry, but it's a commercial business at its core, and particularly the large multinationals, they're beholden to shareholders. So they profit comes first. They might be selling art, and the art itself is amazing, and you have many individuals who work within those structures who believe and are completely guided by their love for the work and the art. But particularly with the larger businesses, if it's not selling, they're not going to be replicating something again because they can't necessarily justify it. Or the number of things that they can publish that are not expected to turn a significant profit is very, very vanishingly small, and a lot of the priority will be given to the things that do have that commercial outcome. So it's like, of course, people who want to do things differently, or things that are untested, or things that you can't immediately draw a line and say that book will sell 100,000 copies and generate X revenue and return. Of course, those people are going to find other ways because their work is still amazing, and there are still people who want to read it as well. And sometimes it's like you can find your audience more directly through that medium. And in fact, I'm going to bring it back to the festival again. We have the wonderful podcaster and Substack writer Sarah Wilson at the festival, and she's got a huge Substack following, and she's been serializing what will be her next book on Substack for the past year or so. She's been interviewing a range of thinkers globally about collapse and kind of environmental, political, social collapse, and how we live through that experience. And I think Substack is such a great medium for that type of thinking because it can be heavy. It can also be very different from one week to the next. So she's created this work that lives on Substack at the moment, and that's what she's coming to talk at the festival about. It will be published as a book, I believe, early next year. But the work is already out there. People are already reading and consuming it. And so from my perspective, if she's going to be here, let's put her on a stage and have her readers and her audience and her fans be able to come and see her. And this is someone who has previously been traditionally published very successfully, but who has chosen to move to Substack as her kind of main method of communicating with her readers for the time being.
Do you think festivals will be able to reckon with a world where authors are publishing on Substack and reaching 50,000 people there? I can't imagine they're going to be winning awards self-publishing on Substack. These are the things that we use to measure a lot of people's, I guess, maybe success isn't the right word, credibility. You build coin for yourself in the medium. And I'm just curious how festivals might reckon in the future with that. How does a festival account for that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's happening now. And it's interesting, we're talking about Sarah Wilson, George Saunders, Salman Rushdie, people who already have a profile through traditional publishing and then have turned to Substack as their kind of medium. Or even like Brandon Sanderson, who's able to self-publish his fantasy books to huge audiences because he's already built that audience base through traditional publishing. So at this moment, it feels like for a writer to be kind of able to generate things on that scale, they need to already have a platform elsewhere for the most part. But I think that is going to shift and is indeed shifting. From a festival perspective, I just think festivals need to evolve and programming needs to evolve. And I've often it's interesting. Some festivals are called readers and writers festivals or readers festivals. I think any writers festival should be able to equally be considered a readers festival. So as far as I'm concerned, my job is to ensure that people who are reading, however they're reading, are able to connect with and hear from the writers whose work they are reading. And if people are reading on Substack, then that's the people who should be on stage. The awards are also really important, of course, and the prestige. And also like reviews and kind of criticism of works, which tends to be very much focused on traditional publishing. Those are also really important kind of mechanisms and informers of the programming process. But I think the whole ecosystem probably needs to kind of adjust and accommodate these new forms. And I don't know what that's going to look like for publishing. I think at the moment publishing goes, okay, you've published a lot of Substacks. Can we just compile those into a book? Like, it's a pretty simple approach to things. It would be interesting to think about how that might or could evolve. And when we're not seeing the end goal of everything being, well, will it be between the pages of a book one day?
So, last question for now. We'll be back in a moment to discuss C.S. Lewis's Narnia novel, The Magician's Nephew, a seminal book in your life. But first, I want to ask, or rather, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the role of literary festivals and maybe arts festivals in general on communities and maybe more broadly cities like Melbourne.
Yeah. I think festivals are such an important space, particularly literary festivals, because readers and writers, those are both mostly solitary acts. They're things that we do in our private spaces, or even if we're doing them in public spaces, we're largely the only human who's present in that moment, whether it's the writing or the reading. And so the opportunity to actually come together, to be in that shared communal space, to meet other like-minded people, to see what sparks, for readers to meet their favorite writers, have their book signed, ask them questions, that just, for me, deepens the entire medium in this really profound and beautiful way. And I think that at their best, the festival is the sense of a dedicated space. Like, it's not any one individual event. It's that collective whole that just feels really alive and has this kind of magic to it. In terms of the impact on a city, it's also like bringing the city to life. We know that cultural activity and being engaged with culture has a really high correlation to being happier, living a happier life and being more functional societies. And those are statistics that get trotted out to justify arts funding, but they're true. They're based on reality, which is that having culture in our lives makes us better people, makes us more empathetic, and having spaces to enjoy that communally amplifies that even more, and also enables people who maybe haven't encountered these things to encounter them. So there's just so many like beautiful positive effects that festivals offer. And I think that's true of all mediums, not just writers' festivals, but I do feel like, particularly in the context of writers' festivals, it's that ability to take something that often is very individual and kind of transition it into the collective for a day, for a weekend, for a week, for the term of the festival. And there are also all these other wonderful benefits as well. You know, I feel like I've been a little bit critical of publishing today, but it's also selling books, and it's like putting money into authors' pockets, and it's supporting their livelihoods, and enabling them to build their audiences, and it like builds that culture, that ecosystem, that cultural fabric of having a strong literary culture. It's all bound up together. And as much as I'm like really responsive to and interested in what's being published, I also hope that I'm creating opportunities for new writers who are unpublished to be on stages, and then the publishers come and they see them and they talk to them and they read their work and they end up publishing them. So it's this like beautiful ecosystem, and I think literary festivals have such a strong role within that.
I love that answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation so far, and we'll be back in a moment to talk some more about The Magician's Nephew. This has been great.
Thanks, Cole.
As for you listening at home, in the car, wherever you are, thanks for being here. But don't go just yet, because there's a bonus episode you don't want to miss. Veronica and I continue our conversation, diving into a seminal piece of art from her life, C.S. Lewis's Narnia novel, The Magician's Nephew. We're going to mull how this multiversal prequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe still enchants her as an adult, how its story mirrors the reading experience, and how the novel has influenced countless other authors, including Susanna Clarke, who points to The Magician's Nephew as a major inspiration for her novel Piranesi. This bonus conversation is exclusive to my paid subscribers here. It's how I managed to spend so much time on this podcast, finding the perfect guests, interviewing them, editing our conversations. Your monthly subscription helps make that all possible, so please consider signing up for one. Alternatively, you can head to the show notes and subscribe to my 5 a.m. Story Talk Arts newsletter, where you'll get access to all my podcast episodes days, weeks, and sometimes even months early. You'll also get access to hundreds of arts articles, most of them focused on screenwriting and writing, many of them exclusive to paid subscribers, as well as the opportunity to join me for monthly Ask Me Anything about the Arts chats to hopefully help you with whatever you're struggling with as a creator. Upcoming guests of this podcast include Black Doves creator Joe Barton, Big Fish screenwriter and Script Notes co-host John August, and Meg LaFauve, screenwriter of both Inside Out films and co-host of The Screenwriting Life. And next week, I'll be joined by actress, filmmaker, author, poet, and activist Amber Tamblyn. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to growing 5 a.m. Story Talk with your help. Hopefully, I'll see you for the bonus episode and some more book talk with Veronica Sullivan.